Hey everyone, welcome to this month's Don't Get Rusty. And as you can see by the title slide up there, today we're doing towered operations. We're calling this one Roger, Roger, cleared for what? Towered airport operations. So let's get right into the nuts and bolts here before we introduce everybody. Just for the folks out there, just so you know what you're looking at, if you are on the computer, you're going to see something like some kind of menu similar to this. And the big thing we want you to know is that if you would like to ask a question, make sure you click on the one that looks like a little cartoon question bubble. Click on that, and then you'll be able to type your question in the box below. But most importantly, make sure you hit that send button so that we will see it. Otherwise, if you type it and you don't hit the send button, we'll never see that. And then over here, we've got the attendee control panel if you're using a tablet of some sort. And the same thing, you're looking for the little question mark box there, a little question mark deal there, type in your question and make sure you hit the send button. So hopefully that takes care of most of it. For a lot of folks, I know sometimes every once in a while we'll get somebody saying they can't hear or whatever, usually restarting it seems to help. But maybe we'll let Stephen comment on that. So let's get right to it. My name is Chris Moser, Senior Director of Flight Training Education here at AOPA. As you can see, I am a CFI. I was a teacher for a long time, and I flew freight for a bit. And there are some of the things I work on. Let's go ahead and also welcome my co-host today, Dan. Introduce yourself, Dan.
Thank you, Chris. Dan Justman. I'm also with the You Can Fly group. I get to work with Chris and Stephen, hidden behind his secrets of webinar camera there. Proud to be able to work with the AOPA Foundation You Can Fly team with the Rusty Pilots programs and the Flight Training Initiative, as well as supporting the high school teams and flying clubs as well.
Wait to get you a picture up on this one here.
I'll do that next time.
All right, cool. And then, of course, as always, behind the scenes, Stephen. Stephen, say hello.
Hello, Stephen.
And
sorry, I'm trying out my Batman voice.
Exactly. It's the dark Stephen rises. But Stephen, can you tell us too, what are some of the common things that we hear from folks when it comes to the technical part? Is it just restarting the webinar, or what works for them?
It kind of depends on what device you're using to watch with, and then I think the go-to program really prefers to have its plugin downloaded versus watching on a web. So I do know like with the poll questions, sometimes I think it opens up a second screen on top of the presentation screen. System's going to close out of that. The audio settings, it really does vary based upon your local settings. It's hard to tell.
Okay, so to try that, maybe if you're just watching through a browser, maybe not do that and download the stuff and or use the app that they have if you're using a tablet. Anyway, thanks, Stephen. Okay, as always, want to thank our sponsors, Boeing, and of course their family of products in ForeFlight and the Jeppesen Company. So we appreciate that as always. And our big reminders. Yes, in fact, I already saw, I think the second question we had that popped up was about wings credit. So if you signed up for this webinar using the same email that you use for your FAAsafety.gov account, you're automatically getting wings credit. You don't need to do anything. We will take care of it just as long as, and that's of course, if you're viewing this broadcast live. If you're watching this later on YouTube, unfortunately, you're not able to get wings credit for that. But as long as you registered using that FAAsafety.gov account, you are good to go. Nothing to do for you. All set. Other common question we get is this being recorded? And yes, of course it is. It'll show up later, honestly, probably like Monday or Tuesday. It'll take a couple of days for our folks to get that uploaded to YouTube. But you can find it under the AOPA Pilot Video channel, and then look under their playlist for Don't Get Rusty webinars. And oftentimes what will happen too is that in the next week or so, it'll be put out in one of the newsletters like AOPA Pilot, that kind of stuff. So you might see it there as well. And you can also find it on AOPA.org webinars page. Again, give us a little bit of time, a couple of days for that to get done because we've got other folks that have to upload that for us. All right, today in aviation history, April 20th, 1962. So what is that, like 80 years ago? Is that right? No, doing my math wrong. 60 years ago. There we go. So almost 60 years ago, a little over 60 years ago, NASA research test pilot Neil Armstrong conducted a flight test in for the Honeywell MH96 flight control system, and then that was in the North American X-15. Stephen, you had a little trivia that went along with this because you did more of the research on this. What was the deal with that flight control system?
Well, this was the third X-15 that they had built out using the new flight control system, and it was a way to kind of consolidate some of the controls into one versus 2 different controls. It lightened the pilot load. So they went on to use the MH-96 and a lot of other aircraft afterwards after a successful test.
Cool. All right. So there's something, sort of a milestone right there, and with the new control system. All right. Let's go ahead and do our poll for today. So Stephen will have that pop up in front, and we'll double check to make sure that it works correctly. So with the poll, what is your experience level with towered airport operations? Is it A, I'm a pro, like I've got this down. B, I'm confident, but I'm always learning. C, they make me nervous, but I want to master it. In other words, I'm a little wary of it, but I definitely want to get better. Or D, airplanes weren't meant to be controlled. So what do you think, Dan? What would your answer be on this one?
Well, for me, I would say I'm confident, but always learning. That's just, I've flown mostly into controlled airports, so that's, what's familiar to me. So I'd say that, but man, there's a lot of uncontrolled fields out there. I would say it's going to be between those two. I'm confident, but always learning, or they make me nervous, but I want to master it.
Cool. That's probably a good guess. I would agree as well. And it comes down to, what part of it too is currency. I know I was some years ago, I was a rusty pilot, and when I flew out of when I flew freight, I flew out of a Bravo every day for a year. But then when I came back, the thing that I was most nervous about was talking on the radio. So I think it's a currency thing too. So how long has it been since you've done it? But even if you haven't done it in a while, it comes back really quick. All right, looks like we've got about 83%. Perfect. Let's go ahead and close the poll, Stephen, and show the results. Yes. Did it work correctly? Good. And then, so we can see there, yeah, Dan, you were right on. 55% saying I'm confident, but always listening. So that's by far the majority. And then the 39% saying they make me nervous, but I want to get better at it, which is hopefully this is a good place for you to be today to learn more about that. And then, of course, I love, as always, our 1%. Usually it's 1% too. Airplanes weren't meant to be controlled. So some folks always like to pick that. I like your sense of humor, I am assuming. Okay, so let's go ahead and now just double check. Are we seeing the screen okay?
We are. Correction, perfect. Clarification from last time.
You got it.
Yes.
So you might recall, if you were with us last month, we had Drew Myers on here from here at AOPA, and we were talking about getting your commercial certificate and some of the things you can do with your commercial. And one of the things that came up in conversation that we weren't completely sure of was, are glider pilots able to act for higher compensation? I mean, tow plane pilots for gliders, if I could talk over myself there. But luckily we had, as always, we've got really, like, our listeners, our viewers here are amazing. And so one of them got back to us and let us know that if you check under 61113G, it does mention that they can do it. But more importantly, it was clarified by a letter of interpretation called the Humphreys Soaring Society of America letter in 2010. And that very much clarified that private pilots are able to tow gliders for higher compensation. So if you want to go check it out, go check out that letter. You can Google that and find that FAA letter of interpretation. All right, let's get to our topic today. So what are we doing today? Well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to be talking about towered operations along those lines, and we're going to talk about some key operating principles. So I'll talk about that first. Then what we're going to look at, and I kind of try to do it in what I thought was a logical flow. We'll talk about arriving into the airspace and really dealing with the stuff with the tower, whether that's Bravo, Charlie, or Delta, and then landing at a towered field. So how would you go about that? And then, of course, departing out. Then we'll talk about some of the stuff that would happen on the ground, the VFR departure clearance, ground ops. That kind of was a last-minute flow that I changed around just because as I was looking at the topics, I'm like, oh, these fit better together. The last things we'll talk about are just talk about transitions through towered airspace, so just flying through it, or maybe doing a VFR flyway, or the official transitions that some Bravos have. And then the very, very last bit is tips from the pros. But one thing I want to make sure that I mention is that there is a handout available. You should find that in the menu for the webinar, and it's you can download that. I've got all kinds of links in there for you. And by far the most useful one, as I was prepping for this, is, I think it's the first one on the list. It's a safety advisor that I put up. So anyway, check that out. Make sure you download that. You got some great links there to help you out. Okay, so let's get to it and just double check in. And just, Dan, are you still there with us as well?
Loud and clear.
All right, perfect. So I know Dan's looking at the questions, and we'll pop in here. So let's talk about these key operating principles. Well, the first thing I wanted to do is that these are kind of overarching. These are things that I felt like were things that you want to use this in any of your interactions with air traffic control. And the first part is, we know that in the regs it says, and I'm remiss about quoting the exact reg, but it basically says that when we're given a clearance by air traffic control, we need to follow it. We need to comply with that. However, remember that there is always, you have the ability as pilot in command, you have a pilot in command authority, that if there's something to do with the safety of flight or something that would do that, you know, if you were to follow that clearance that would, for example, you're flying VFR and they vectored you towards a cloud, you've got the pilot in command authority to say, hey, I'm unable to do that, or, you know, if in the worst case scenario, declare an emergency and say, I can't do that. So don't forget that while we want to make sure we're following our ATC clearances, that we are required to do so, don't forget that you also have PIC authority. You are the one responsible for the safety of the flight. So just keep that in mind as we talk about all these things that, all these topics today. Another one that's really useful is the sterile cockpit idea, and I bet most of you guys are familiar with that, which is the idea that when, especially like taxiing, if you're in the pattern or you're, you know, somewhere close to the airport environment and it's getting busy, maybe you're going into Bravo and it's really busy, then you limit all conversations in the cockpit, if you've got somebody else with you, to just what is necessary for safety of flight. You're not having chats or you know, viewing or whatever. And in some cases, like say you've got folks on board, passengers, family on board, you can even hit the old isolate switch so that you can make sure you're listening to air traffic control if there was some distraction, maybe from kids in the back or whatever. So just keep that in mind. Sterile cockpit's a great idea. And then the other one is, there is nothing better than preparation, preparation, preparation. So what I mean by that is that when, especially if you're going to a towered airspace or airspace that is new to you, and it's something that you're a little hesitant about, or you just haven't done it before, make sure you do research ahead of time. Don't fly to an airport sort of blind and sort of figure out, oh, I'll just check my ForeFlight in the air or my EFB in the air and sort of find it, or look at the chart as I'm flying there. Don't do that. So make sure you do that preparation. Look to find out what are the local procedures that they may have. Maybe they've got something different than what might be the standard, or something special that they do in addition to the standard things. Are there landmarks that they use? I know there's some airports, even non-towered airports, sometimes will have special landmarks that they'll use. Do you know what the noise abatement procedures are? Like here at Frederick, we've got one that's posted, and it's, and I'll talk about the sources where you find this stuff in a little bit, but we've got one where you've got to fly out over to the quarry at a certain altitude before we turn on course or turn the pattern, just to help avoid the noise over the neighborhoods that are nearby. Traffic and the flow, and really this was, I was just combining two things together, traffic flow and traffic. What kind of traffic do they have? Does this airport, maybe you're going to a Delta, Harrisburg is an example. Actually, I'm thinking of Lancaster, but they occasionally have airline traffic that comes in and out. There's some regional airline traffic. So, or Harrisburg International as well has got airline traffic that goes in and out. So what kind of traffic goes on there, and how heavy is the flow? And if you're going someplace like New York or up in that area, they will have traffic flow restrictions based on the amount of traffic that they do have. So you want to research and find these things out. Make sure you know your frequencies that you're going to be looking at. Where can I find those? Jot these things down, anticipate what they might be to help you, so that there's one less thing that you're fumbling around for or trying to copy down while you're in the air. If you can anticipate as much as possible, that's a good thing. Are there altitudes? And then finally, do you have all the charts that you need, whether that's on an electronic flight bag or in an electronic flight bag, or paper charts, whatever it is you happen to be using. But just try to research all these ahead of time. What do you got, Dan?
With regards to that research, Chris, we had a question from Mike, is where do you find the information for all this preparation and arrivals?
That is a great question. And in fact, I know I think it's coming up in one of these next couple of slides. I will talk about sources of getting this information, but the quick preview I'll tell you right now is use things like the chart supplement, the old little green book. We used to call it the AFD, Airport Facility Directory. That's a great place to look up information on your airport. And one quick one too, because I'll go into more detail later, is the AOPA Airport Directory is awesome too. You can actually print out little kneeboard things, and they've got lots of information about the airport and the charts. So like I said, I have a whole slide that will talk about just that, or has a lot of detail about that. All right, any other ones, Dan?
Nope, that's good for now.
All right, cool. And that includes, by the way, I see somebody, Larry, they're saying, how do we find out about landmarks? Again, oftentimes there are a couple places you can look in the chart supplement / the little green book. I know it's so weird for me to say. I still think of it as the AFD, but the chart supplement will often have notes in there, and also the airport website too. The websites for the different airports will lay out the various procedures. So the big thing is prepare as much as possible. And trust me, you know what else? And I don't know about you, Dan, you might be able to tell me, when you prepare, to me, it takes some of the stress out of going someplace new because I know what's coming. Has that been your experience as well?
I hate getting caught off guard. And of course, you can't be perfectly prepared for everything, but absolutely. I take a lot of time in pre-flight planning just to make sure I'll get the airport that I'm and take a look at it and take the airport that I'm going to and alternates and everything I can do to be well prepared. Sometimes I even create a cheat sheet just to frequencies and things like that, just so I've got it readily available. So yeah, prep.
Yep, and I love the cheat sheet idea. You lay it out and what might be coming, makes it so much easier. Hey, we got Brian there saying too that the book formerly known as the AFD. We need like a symbol for it, just like the green book. That's like this is formerly known as the AFD because the chart supplement is always weird for me to say. All right, so let's get into actually what we do, and these are the procedures. And by the way, there was so much information as I was going through this that we even thought about. I think we're going to do a follow-up next month into some of the really specifics, especially for Bravo and Charlie. So today we're going to cover some of the general procedures that you'll follow, but next month the plan, as you'll see, is for us to talk about like what are the actual radio calls that you'll make, or how do you actually fly the transition, all those like really in-depth nitty-gritty interactions. We'll get into that. So just keep that in mind. But I do have, like, again, those links that we've got on the handout. We've got some really good stuff, including the airport operations. I believe it's the air safety. They've got the thing called Say It Right and some other stuff too. Some really good stuff on this. All right. So number one, this is something we talked about yesterday, Dan, and now when and how to make the initial call. And that being the case, the aim, and I know that Dan, you said the same thing as me. It's like I had always heard or remembered 10 miles out, right? It was always the thing. It's all about 10 miles out. But actually in the aim, it says 15 miles out is what they would like us to do. And that's under aim 4-3-2. That is the part on towered, because when you get into 4-3-3, it gets into more of the non-towered operations. And so they want us to make the call about 15 miles out to the tower, whatever. And so obviously that's going to make sense for a Delta. When you get into Charlie and Bravo, the airspace is bigger. Like at Charlie, they want us to call about 20 out to start talking to approach control. And then in a Bravo, it's like I would probably call earlier as well. But of course, you can always fly, legally, technically, you can fly right up to the edge of the airspace before you talk to them. But it's preferred to do that when that sort of thing. Go ahead, Dan.
Is there, we had a note here that says, the slide says 15 miles, and that's what's in the aim, but also noted ATIS may request a different number. Have you experienced that?
I don't know that I have, but that wouldn't surprise me because we get into those local procedures where they put a note on there. We want you to do this particular thing. So again, AIM is that guide for sort of how they want us to comply with the regs or how they'd recommend it, but that doesn't mean that a certain airport might have something a little bit different, and that's where you find those things out. So that's interesting. I'd be curious to know the person who asked that question. Maybe give us some details about that. What airport was that, and what did they ask? Just out of curiosity, I'd like to know. The other part is when you make that initial call, when you're dealing with Bravo or Charlie especially, because typically Delta is not as much of an issue because they're typically not quite as busy. But for that, the question I often get when I'm instructing is, do you make the cold call? Like you literally just broadcast in the blind and lay it all out, Cessna 65659er, requesting clearance into the Bravo, and you give them all the details? Or do you just call up and say, Potomac approach Cessna 65659er VFR request? The way that I gauge that is how busy they are. If I get on frequency, and especially like here with Potomac approach, which is our Bravo area around the DC Baltimore area, if they're really busy, I'm just going to try to chime in with that VFR request because I know that I am not the priority, that IFR traffic is their priority. And so I will just pop that in and just wait for them to get back to me. If I'm waiting a few minutes and they still haven't responded to me, I might just do the same thing again. Because if they're so busy, you got to remember that when we spout all that stuff off, they've got to write all that information down. And so I want to make sure that they're ready to copy when I do give my request. So for me, it's not how busy they are too. That said, at the same time, I've even had it here at like the local Frederick Tower. sometimes it's like, if it's really quiet, they might be enjoying a coffee, whatever, you catch them off guard. So maybe in that point, if it's really quiet, make sure you don't rapid fire it off. Give them time to like, oh, think I got to jot this down. So maybe I change my pace a little bit, just to give them a second to get ready to write everything down. What do you
Chris,
think?
I've got a clarification question. Is it 15 miles from the airport or 15 miles from the airspace?
That is a great question. And what it said was, and in fact, let me just pull this up right now so I can look at that AIM 4-3-2, which is why I've got my FAR AIM here at the ready, literally, so I could look these things up. There we go, 4-3-2. And let me just scan through really quick for that 15-mile part. What did I think I said? Was it C6? Let me just look. Here it is. 15 miles from the airport is what it recommends.
From the airport.
So initial call up should be made 15 miles from the airport.
Okay, and I've got another one related to the 15 miles. Darren says, I've been outside the 15-mile circle, but was told I'm in the box, in quotes, and should call earlier in class Charlie. What is this box they refer?
I've never heard in the box. It sounds like maybe it's some ATC slang potentially. I'm not a controller, so it's like I may be wrong about that. But what they are probably talking about is that when you look on the chart for a Charlie, there are little magenta boxes that are out there, and they request you to contact them 20 nautical miles out. So they want you to call, because remember, the whole reason for a Charlie and then a Bravo is that they're busy, and so they're sequencing traffic. So if you're planning on going into their airspace, it's important to get that early so they can start planning ahead for how they're going to fit you in with all the IFR traffic that they've got as well. And I'm assuming in today's discussion that we're flying VFR. So That's likely what they meant.
Back to the prep, we've had a couple notes here, and this is one thing that I neglected to mention on my preparation is a lot of times, well, this is really pre-ForeFlight and Garmin Pilot, but I used to print out the airport diagrams that I knew I was traveling to and the alternates as well, and just had those to quick glance as well. So a lot of others do that same technique.
There you go. And so I see, yeah, and I agree with that. In fact, that's coming up later. We'll talk about that when we get to ground ops of having an airport diagram as well. Okay. So I see stuff popping up. I know Dan's helping with the questions because I can't watch all of those. All right. Position reporting. This is one that we've had conversations with our local controllers here. I have a feeling this is probably more to do with not your Charlies and Bravos, because they're going to give you a squawk code and they're going to see you on radar. But when you're coming into a Delta, remember that Deltas don't necessarily have radar. In fact, most of them probably don't. So don't assume that a control tower has radar, and again, especially with your Delta airports. So it's really important to be accurate with your position reporting. So if you know that as you're approaching, already be thinking about, am I northeast? Am I southeast? What direction am I from the airport, so that I can let them know as I'm approaching what direction I'm coming from. Because one of the things that the tower controllers tell us here is that if somebody says they're coming from the east, they literally look to the east and say it's anywhere from here to here. In other words, like a 180-degree arc. It's anywhere here these airplanes could be coming from, and that just gets down to that accuracy of reporting. So really try to be accurate and say I am northeast or I'm southeast. If you know, one easy trick is if you know that you're pointed right at the airport, your nose is at the airport, look at the bottom of your heading indicator, and that'll tell you what direction you are from the airport, which is helpful. Or if you're using a GPS or other nav aid, use that to help you, assuming, especially like the GPS is going to probably have that magenta line going straight at the airport if you're following it to it. So please be accurate about it. And also with your mileage too, and that's where, of course, the GPS makes that much easier now. And with the radar, don't assume. And the other thing that was interesting as I was reading through the AIM and prepping some of this is that, or maybe it was in some, I don't know, I was reading a bunch of stuff too. I was reading articles and all kinds of things, a lot of them on those links in the handout. But one of the things they mentioned too is that when you get into the tower environment, and I think the implication here was even for your Charlies and Bravos, the tower controller is not looking at the radar. That is not their primary thing. Like, that's departure. That's what they do. For the tower controller, by FAA guidance or whatever they've got, they're supposed to be using visual separation as much as possible to keep airplanes apart. So they're not necessarily going to be looking down at that radar screen. They're going to be using, and like in the case of the Deltas, they're using binoculars. So please keep that in mind, that they are totally visual. And so you won't necessarily be asking them for radar service in that tight tower environment. So just keep that in mind. Okay, and then finally, I'm assuming most folks know, obviously, when you go into a towered airport, we're going to fly whatever they tell us to do. It's unlike the non-towered where we recommend that 45 entry to downwind. It just depends on where you're coming from, and they'll assign you something. They might tell you, make a straight in. They might tell you to, enter on the downwind and report midfield. It's pretty common. Again, they do those kind of things at a Delta because they don't have radar, and they're just trying to get you someplace where they can pick you up visually and then sequence you around. But most common question, and I know we've answered this one before back when we had Damien and other folks from ATC on, it's the question of what is a 3-mile base? What do they mean by when they use that kind of phraseology? And the question really was, does that mean they want your base leg to be spaced 3 miles out and then extended? So where we can see my mouse kind of moving. Do they mean that? Or do they mean normal base distance, but extended 3 miles out? And that, of course, is what they want. They want your base leg so that when you turn final, you should be at your normal distance. For most of us, probably a half mile, right? It could be, depending on the speed of your aircraft, maybe you do it a little wider than that. But the FAA, the guidance and the aim and everything is like no closer than a 1/4 mile. So what you want to do, if they say something like make a 3 mile or 2 mile or whatever it is base, they want you to report. What they mean is get your base into that normal distance so that when you go to turn final, you're at that typical half mile or whatever it might be. Okay. Let's jump into the second part of arrival procedures here, which is this, by the way, is in the safety advisory. It's the first link on the handout. It's the flow of arrival comms, which I thought might be useful for folks to know. And so typically what you're going to do is you're normally going to get ATIS, then talk to approach control, then you're going to be handed over to tower, and then finally go to the ground frequency once either they hand you over or you get clear of the runway, depending on what direction you've been given after landing. So because sometimes tower might say stay with me, or sometimes they might say switch to ground, and if in doubt you get clear and you don't hear anything, then you usually just switch to ground and call them up, because it's at that point they're going to take over your operation. The one thing that could happen to you, though, to anticipate, especially like if you're using flight following, is that you might already be like, if you're using flight following, let's say you've gone on a relatively long cross country and you've been with center, and then center hands you over to approach, or maybe just flying around here in the area where we are, you might be using flight following and you're on with Potomac approach the whole time. But as you approach the airport where you're going, then you're going to need to get ATIS. So that could happen to you. You might already be on with approach, get ATIS on your COM 2, and then like approach will even tell you, look, let us know when you have ATIS. You're 15 miles from the airport, you're 20 miles from the airport, advise when you have ATIS information, Charlie, whatever it might be. So just keep that in mind. But your general flow is going to be, assuming you're not already talking to approach, is going to be ATIS, approach, tower, ground. And then the other thing that you can do is leverage your nav aids to help find the airport. Of course, this is way easier now than when I was learning to fly. You've got GPS. GPS makes this stuff so much easier. You've got a nice visual representation to seeing where the airport is. But you don't forget, you've got other things too. You could be using the VOR. For example, I showed a picture over here, and I might be annoying people with my mouse moving around, but I want to use it to point, is that right here, you've got a VOR near Prescott, Arizona. And so that VOR can be used to help you get to where the airport is and have an idea of, sort of like, I'm going to follow this particular radial in. And then once I know I'm there, that I'm looking for the airport. In this case, if I'm coming from the west, then I'm going to be looking down here to the southeast from the VOR. So use those. You could even use an ILS or a localizer frequency, if you're familiar with that, to help you get lined up on final if you were doing a straight in, for instance. So use those nav aids. Now, here's my one tip. And Dan, I know we were chatting about this one yesterday, and you had an experience like mine. I'll tell you a really quick story. I was flying once back here to Frederick. It was getting into the evening. It was sort of in that sort of sunset type of time. It wasn't dark yet. It wasn't even close to dark, but it was definitely the sun getting low on the horizon. So I'm flying to the west, and it was hazy. So the sun was reflecting on that haze. I had Frederick set in the GPS, and so I know I'm going straight towards it, and I was on with flight following. I had already transitioned over to tower. They told me what they wanted me to do. And so I was like, well, I know the airport's straight ahead, but the visibility wasn't great, and I couldn't see the airport. But I was like, well, you know what? And I was like, I've got to get down to pattern altitude. I got to start descending. And what happened was I got into a situation where I was like, I know the airport's in front of me. I just can't see it yet. And I didn't like it. I was not comfortable at all. Luckily, it wasn't busy, and I was able to eventually see the airport early enough. But from that experience, I then decided, you know what? I'm like, you know what I should have done is I should have stayed higher. I should have stayed up at a little higher at altitude, and you know, that way when I identify the airport, then I could descend knowing where the pattern was rather than basically blindly flying into the pattern. Dan, you said you had a similar experience too.
I did, same exact story. It was right after I got my private certificate. I did my flight training down in Central Florida, and one of my first flights as a certificated pilot was to fly down the Florida Keys. It was an amazing experience. I got towards Key West, and I was, you know, there's a military base down there, and I didn't want to interfere with that, and I thought I had everything set, scored to go. I was at an altitude that was too low to see Key West Airport. I could not pick out the open space or the runway because stuff's jam-packed in there really well. It all just looked like neighborhood to me, and I couldn't find it until I was right up on top of it. And a bit embarrassing on that front, but same thing, Chris. Lesson learned is that I don't drop down to pattern altitude until I know I'm within that, you know, engine out glide distance.
Exactly. So the big thing I'll tell you too, and this is one I was even wondering, the reason I didn't want to start climbing too, coming back into Frederick, because I was worried about, well, I'm supposed to be at pattern altitude when I get there. But later on, I actually asked the controllers, I'm like, hey, this happened to me. Would it have been a problem if I'd stayed up at altitude? And they were like, totally, just tell us what you're doing. So the big thing that you'll want to do there is it's okay to stay, but just inform ATC like, hey, I've got really bad visibility or I've got haze and I can't see. I'm going to stay up at this, I want to stay at this altitude. Maybe it's 1,000 feet higher or whatever. And then until I see the airport, and I even asked them, I said, would it have been a problem if I had not been able to see the airport till I was over top? And they said, no worries. It said, just tell us what you're doing. We get it. And then once you identify the airport, then we would have worked with you to get you into the pattern. So don't be afraid to do something maybe that's out of the norm based on, you know, to keep you safe.
Yep, we had a note about communicating with approach or tower that you're having problems seeing the airport. I think that was the case for both of us as we were. You know, we weren't radio silent. It was just, you know, airport's not in sight. And then they're like, well, it's right in front of you. And I'm like, I know, I'm still looking. So we had a two-way conversation going on there, but I didn't want to keep the frequency tied up either.
Yeah, exactly. And by the way, I have a story that I tell. Like I kind of do this whole bit about it during the Rusty Pilot presentations. But when I was a student pilot, I was flying up to Capital City in Harrisburg, and I could not see the airport. And there's, like I said, there's a whole story that I won't take the time to do it right now. But I literally had the tower, and because they happened to have radar and approach control there at Harrisburg, they vectored me around the pattern and got me lined up on final, because it's like I was just like, hey, I'm a student pilot, I don't see the airport, and I just could not see this thing, and they vectored me around the pattern and got me lined up. So don't be afraid to ask for help when you can't see it. Let them know, because think about it, they want you to be safe. They want us to be safe, and so they'll provide that service if you need it to help get you back to the airport. That's what they care about. And I can tell you that pretty much every controller I've ever spoken with, that's their main priority, is to keep us safe. Okay, let's talk about now when you get, now you've made the approach in, now you've been handed over to tower. Again, I'm assuming like most of the folks here are certificated pilots, so I was just trying to pick out things that I thought would be you know, just things to consider, maybe things people get potentially confused about. So in the Air Safety Institute handout, the safety advisor, it has the different types of landing clearances. So I just laid out some of them here that I often see, and they talk about these in that material. But obviously we know cleared to land. If you get cleared to land, we know what that one means. You're cleared to land's full stop. So we know that's a full stop. So that's pretty straightforward. But there are some other things that you may get, and sometimes I find confusion with folks that I work with about what they mean. Of course, most of us know touch and go, and you can be cleared touch and go. So with the touch and go, that they are expecting you to land and then take off again. And I've had that at airports. However, some airports that you go to, like here at Frederick, they typically will not give you a touch and go clearance. Instead, what they give you is the option. And the option allows you to go full stop, do a low approach, or, you know, do a touch and go too. So it lets you do what you want. And so that's really a useful one for when you're doing flight training or practicing landings. That's a great one. So if you have the option, it allows you to do any of those things. So you are allowed a full stop. Obviously, if you know you're going to be full stop, advise ATC, because that way they can plan on making sure the traffic's spaced behind you appropriately, and they know what you're going to do if you already know. But with the option, you have the option to do whatever you want. Occasionally, you might actually, typically you'll request these. I can't say that I've ever been assigned one. They might ask me if I would mind doing one, but a short approach, and that's where you practice your power off 180. You're going to get a beam in the spot, pull the power, and then glide it in and keep it kind of tight, tighter than you normally would. So that's a good one to have too. You might get a low approach, or you could ask for a low approach. I shouldn't say they wouldn't give you that, but you can ask for the low approach, which allows you to fly along the runway without actually touching down. And then always be ready if you're going to an airport that has multiple runways, especially parallel runways, that maybe they've been vectoring you in, like Deer Valley in Arizona, where I used to fly. They had two controllers. We had the north pattern and the south pattern. And so you might be coming in and they're setting you up for final on the north runway, but now they know that you want to park on the south side, and that the option, they might tell you to sidestep, or maybe it's for traffic purposes. You're coming in on the larger runway, but they want you to sidestep over. This is something that RFR pilots out there will probably be familiar with happening. But in this case, it could happen VFR too. You're told to sidestep to that shorter runway or whatever it might be for traffic flow issues. And so you got to be ready to then make that little sidestep over to the next final, and of course be familiar with where that other runway is. Go ahead, Dan.
A lot of notes on the option. Does that also include a stop and go?
Yes, if you look up the definition of the option, and I'm trying to remember where I saw this, I think it's in that safety advisor. I didn't go digging in the AIM for it, but it allows you to kind of do what you want. So yeah, even a stop and go, it's like your runway at that point. Again, if I know that I'm going to be doing something that's going to take a little bit more time, then if I'm doing the option, usually I'm doing it because I want a touch and go or maybe a low approach. I will probably advise ATC though. Like if they give me the option, I might tell them, hey, just say no, I'm going to do a stop and go, because that way I give them that little extra buffer to let them know, like, hey, I'm going to be a little longer on the runway than you might have been expecting from my previous landings or previous whatever I was doing. So there we go, pilot controller glossary. Thanks, Brian. You can check it out in there. Okay, and yes, like I know Robert mentions there with tail draggers that you have to do the stop and go to count as a landing. Yeah, because it doesn't count for currency otherwise. So cool. All right, thanks you guys. So you're always on top of it, and we appreciate it. And then the other thing, I haven't had this happen too often, but I did have it. I think it was Prescott in Arizona one time. I flew up there. You can get the land and hold short type of situation, and there's a whole article I believe I put. There's a really big one in. Let's see. There's a really big one in the handout, and it was on just land and hold short operations. Really well done by AOPA, so I like that one a lot. That's why I put that link in there for you. And of course, there's lots of FAA information about this one too. But when you're doing a land and hold short, if you accept it, then remember, you're not required to. It's up to you. In fact, it's your responsibility to make sure that you can actually put it down and stop it in the whatever the distance is available. But don't forget to consider all factors, because I think when I did this, I was a newer pilot back then, and I don't know that I fully considered density altitude at Prescott, Arizona, which I believe is around 4,000 or 5,000 feet. Everything worked out fine. I was in a 172 and there was no issue, but make sure you consider everything. What's the wind doing? Do you have a tailwind? That's going to affect your rollout. The temperature, right? And of course, temperature and altitude affect density altitude. So wherever you are, and then the runway condition, is it wet, et cetera. So there's way more information in that link that I provided on the handout, but check it out. So just don't forget, if you're doing land and hold short, number one, you don't have to accept it, but if you do, make sure that you're definitely confident on what to do. And that handout, or the link on the handout even goes into what to do if you have to go around or things of that sort. So sort of how to handle that. Okay, anything, Dan, before I move on? Nope, I'm assuming we're good to go then. So now let's talk about departure, and then we'll get into the ground stuff. For departure, this has been around for a few years, but I thought it would probably be a good idea for me to just mention the lineup and wait. Remember that, of course, a few years ago, they changed it to the ICAO standard, so we don't call it position and hold anymore. Of course, position and hold being where we would be cleared to taxi out onto the runway and then hold in position until they give us our takeoff clearance. That is now called lineup and wait. So we're going to hear that lineup and wait runway, 2-3, and then we're waiting. One quick safety tip is that while the FAA says that if you're there for more than a minute to query ATC, I think it's a minute or 90 seconds, our Safety Institute even says 30 to 45 seconds. If you're out there that long and they haven't given your takeoff clearance, don't be afraid to query, because basically remind them that they are, and thanks, Terry, 5,000 feet on Prescott. Don't forget to remind them that you're there, just in case they're human, they may have forgotten. And so just we want to make sure that we're out of the way of any traffic that might be landing or things like that. Now, this one, Dan, I know we were chatting about this one. This is one that's come up, and my gosh, online, what a debate. What do you do on departure, and when can you turn on course? And it's like, this is one that I had been asked before, and it was just out at shows or whatever, and I didn't have the opportunity at that point to research it. But this was one of the first things that came up to me in prepping this one. I was like, okay, what is the deal with that? So I really went looking for guidance on this one. And the crazy thing is there's not really any specific guidance other than what I found here. So two things you might hear. Number one, if you're told by a towered field, maintain runway heading. This is typically going to be at a place where you've got parallel runways. I remember this at Deer Valley. And it's right in the term there, maintain runway heading. So they want you to maintain, like, for example, if you're taking off on runway 7 at Deer Valley, they want you to maintain 070, even if the wind is drifting you off center line, because they're assuming that if everybody maintains runway heading, all airplanes will be affected by that drift together. So if you get that one, maintain the heading and don't worry about maintaining center line. Here's what I was able to find, you guys. In the AIM, in 4-3-2, C6, and this was something that I was kind of pointed to from looking at some forum posts and people debating this like crazy. There's not really any guidance on when you can turn, other than in the AIM, it says that for the departure from a towered field in that section, it says otherwise you should maintain center line 1/2 mile beyond departure and when you're within 300 feet of the pattern. And then sort of the implication is then turn on course. But I know, Dan, you and I have both had it where it's like, I've been told left turnout approved, right? When can you do that? If in doubt, ask if you're not sure. Typically, I wait till I'm past the departure end of the runway, and then I'll turn to the west or whatever. We have noise abatement here, so I usually just follow that, which is basically going to work out to what there's recommended here. But there have been people that ask, what if it's a 10,000 foot runway? Do I have to wait all the way to the departure end? If you're not sure, don't be afraid to ask and verify that. But again, I would normally fly to the end. Why? Because that's what I was taught. There's no guidance out there, unfortunately, for you guys. So defer to noise abatement. What's been your experience, Dan, with that one?
I'm gonna just rest with I don't know yet, because I've heard a lot and still don't know. So typically, I would I would fly out runway heading and stay on that to traffic pattern altitude and above. But I've had the left turnout approved. That, like, if you've got a flight plan, they know where you're headed, and they might help you out. So I'm going to plead the fifth on this one.
Yeah. There's a great question that I see Vinny just popped in there too. And by the way, somebody put the reference. It's in the handout. You should see a handout section. If for some reason you can't see that, I know that we post it with the YouTube video. And if you really can't find it, I'm sure that Stephen wouldn't mind if you just emailed him. He'd be able to just email us at ftinitiative. We'll put that in later in the thing, ftinitiative@aopa.org. If you email us, we can certainly send you the handout. But Vinny saying, how long do you query? If they told you to maintain runway heading, how long do you wait? Well, I go out a little ways, and if I feel like, hey, I want to turn on course, don't be afraid, especially if there's a break. Like if they're crazy busy, you try to jump in when you can. But if they're not crazy busy, they just kind of say, is it okay to turn on course? Generally, if I'm at pattern altitude and above, I might be asking and you have to keep your situational awareness going on. Is the pattern crazy busy behind you? Then I'm going to want to be above pattern before I'm worried about trying to turn on course. Because if they think about it, get up and away from the airport and then proceed on course. But yeah, you can always query them. In fact, I even saw that in some of the things I was reading that it's like sometimes it seemingly ATC might forget that they put you on that and you're just kind of heading out. I had that happen with New York one time, had me heading out over the water, and I was like, I don't really like this. I want to turn back in towards land. And so they usually will comply, or they might tell you, I need you to go for 2 more miles and then I'm going to turn you. So you can ask them that stuff. Don't be afraid to ask. Okay.
So to that point, Chris, Brad says if assigned runway heading, that's your last ATC clearance. Mm-hmm. Making a turn in the class Delta without clearance violates 91-123.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. That's why you want to get that permission from them for them to say turn on course or resume on navigation. They'll say something like that to clear you to do whatever. But yeah, if they've told you to fly runway heading, I'm not going to turn away from it on my own, barring me getting out of the Delta, me exiting the Delta. Now I'm on my own, sort of thing there. Because I'm at that point, I'm not talking to, or I'm not under their control anymore unless they've handed me over to approach or something like that. So yeah, so it's like, just ask. Don't be afraid to ask. That's the biggest thing. Here's the flow of arrival comms. You'll see it's just the reverse with one little thing extra, which I'm going to talk about on the next slide. So typically leaving an airport on the ground, you're going to get your ATIS to get the information. At a Charlie or a Bravo, you're going to call clearance delivery. You typically are not going to do that at most Deltas, because a lot of Deltas will have that combined anyway. But you're going to call clearance delivery, and I'll explain that on the next slide coming up. Then you're going to call ground, then tower, and then departure. In fact, tower will then hand you over to departure. So that's the basic flow. That is in that safety advisor, is kind of where I got that from. So check that out. That really is a great, great thing. There we go. So Ronnie mentions tower asked me to make an early turn to avoid a blimp. Good idea. We don't want to run into those folks. All right, so let's talk about what can happen. This happened to me when I was a student pilot the first time at a Tersa. And so that was in fact, the Tersa is still there. There's a couple still hanging around. This was up at Capital City in Harrisburg. And Tersa basically is a Delta airport that happens to have radar control, and they put a terminal radar service area around it. And so they will act like approach control. It's not the same as a Charlie. You're not required to operate or to use their services within that, other than within the Delta, the area around it. You don't have to, but it's obviously a good idea because they're going to give you basically flight following and traffic advisories. But definitely at a Bravo and a Charlie, before you depart, you want to call clearance delivery, because think about how busy they are, and they are going to give you a clearance with basic VFR directions on how to get out. My instrument pilots out there, you're going to recognize this craft thing. This craft thing is amazing. Not only is it great for getting an instrument clearance down, but the other part that's really cool about it is every time ATC gives you any kind of clearance or direction, they're going to follow this format. And that actually, when you know that, makes it way easier to then copy things down. So the C stands for cleared to. Now that's typically only an IFR thing. Now we might get that, for a taxi clearance, they'll say cleared to runway, or actually they don't even say that. They say taxi to runway 23 via whatever. So we don't really get that clearance generally unless we're doing IFR. But here's the important part. They're going to tell you, here's a VFR clearance, a similar one or something you might get. Set the 65659er on departure, fly heading 360, maintain VFR at 1,600 or below. Departure frequency is 119.65 and squawk 0123. And so it's going to be in that order. This is kind of like a note, just a little sample note. This came from our Rusty Pilots course, but that's the kind of note that I might take as I'm jotting things down. But notice what they're doing. They're definitely giving you a direction to fly. So in this case, on departure, fly heading 360. And this is the one where I think it comes up sometimes, where you've been given this departure thing, but tower told you clear for takeoff, maintain runway heading. Let's say that runway heading is 300, but then you were told to fly heading 360. Barring them telling you go to heading 360, you can either query them, or they're going to hand you over to departure relatively quickly, and then just ask them, what do you want me to do? It's like, so if they switch me over from tower to departure right away, I might tell them departure 65659 or VFR climbing 1,000 for 1,500, and I might tell them something along the lines of maintaining runway heading or on runway heading. So let them query them, ask them, when do you want me to go to this 360 thing, or when can I resume my own navigation? So don't be afraid to ask. Okay, so that craft thing, great little mnemonic. You might want to check that out and use that. That'll help you deal with those VFR clearances that you're going to get in Bravo and Charlie. Now, ground ops, and this is that sources of information I promised earlier. Here it is. And some of the ones that I know that people were just chiming in on the questions in the chat, telling me about tons more. But when it comes to taxiing, whether you've just landed and you've gotten clear of the runway, and please don't forget, don't stop on the active runway. In fact, don't stop on any runway. What you want to do is, once you land, get clear at the safest and the next available taxiway, and then get clear. And then what you really should have is have a taxi diagram before you taxi, whether that's you're coming into that airport and you've already prepped for it, and I've got my taxi diagram, whether it's printed or I'm using my electronic flight bag, or if I am departing that airport as well. I've already gotten that information, whether printed or my EFB, I've already got that taxi diagram in front of me. Number one, it's going to make writing down your taxi clearance easier, because you're going to jot it down, and then you can actually figure out where you're going before you even start moving. And then the other part being, it's just going to help you find your way. Don't forget that if in doubt, that you ask for a progressive taxi. And of course, if you're not familiar, a progressive taxi is where they will give you turn-by-turn directions all along the way. They'll say, proceed up here, hold short of this, turn this way, you know, turn left onto Bravo, whatever it might be. So that being the case, don't be afraid to ask for it. And in fact, I've always wondered, like, is that a pain in the butt? Am I giving them extra work to do and they don't like it? And I've been told by controller after controller, no, it is not a pain in the butt. It's a bigger pain in the butt if you go onto an active runway or you go the wrong way and now you've messed up my entire taxi flow. So they say, please ask for a progressive if you're not familiar, if you need help. Go ahead, Dan.
So we had one that popped up that I think applies to a lot of situations. It's the question was, when landing a little long and they say exit to the right and you just miss the turn, do you turn around and go back or keep going to the end of the runway and take that taxiway? So any advice when things don't go as planned or as instructed? What should you as a pilot do?
So I have seen this before, and I can't quote a reg right now or anything, but I know that I am 99% confident that I recall reading or talking to ATC, you are not supposed to turn around unless they tell you to. So continue forward and go to the next available taxiway. The only thing is, if maybe it's not busy and somebody's not hot on your tail or whatever, you might say, is it okay? Do you want me to turn around here? I missed it. But generally speaking, they just want you to go forward. You're going to make better speed probably that way than stopping and then turning around and coming off, especially if there's somebody behind you. And remember, when you're on the runway, that is your runway. So it's like, even if you messed up and somebody has to go around, while that's certainly, you know, you feel bad about that, at the same time, we don't want to cause a safety situation by you stopping and turning around. So unless ATC gives you permission or tells you to do that, just keep going. Keep going.
And you can always just tell them that you're unable, right? Like that would be the best situation to do, and then together you can figure out the next best course of action.
Exactly. Yep. Work with them. Remember, they're there to keep us safe, and that's their main priority. One thing too to remember is that, I know this has been around for a few years too, is that there used to be a thing, a taxi 2 clearance, where we could just cross whatever was in our way. If they told us taxi runway 23, you know, and cross it, that's no longer the case. They can give you one runway crossing, one at a time. And there's a link at the bottom of the handout with the FAA stuff about this. So for example, here at Frederick, we've got 2 crossing runways. And so they will tell us, you know, cross runway 30. So they can give you one at a time. But as you approach a runway, always verify. Am I sure? Did I write that I have a clearance across this runway? If unsure, stop and verify. And then, of course, I'm looking both ways and checking to make sure no traffic's coming, even when I am crossing a runway. So be careful about that. And yeah, just like I said, don't assume you're crossing a bunch of runways. At most, they will give you one runway clearance at a time, and then specifically for whatever runway that is coming up. All right. And then here's that sources of information part that I was talking about, the chart supplement, the old AFD, or as I said, Brian, I love what you said there, the book formerly known as the AFD. So like I said, I think we'll have a marketing thing on some green books for that, a little graphic. Again, look at your charts, whether it's your sectional, your TAC. It used to be a little whack, but those aren't around anymore. But the sectional and TAC are great charts to look at. Use your EFB, you can zoom in and out. And check those things out. And there are ways, even within the EFB, and I'm remiss now because I was looking it up yesterday, of how to get to the back. I think it's you just tap on the flyway part and it'll flip it over for you. So learn how to use that before you go. Learn how to like move your charts around and see the different parts of it. If you're using an electronic flight bag. The AOPA airport directory, it's online. I have a little graphic up there above with that. It's great stuff in there. Like print out the little kneeboard diagram, and we've got all the instrument approach procedures, et cetera, that are in there too. Use your EFB, whether it's ForeFlight, Garmin Pilot, et cetera. And then finally, even if you're a VFR pilot, the instrument approach procedures books, and of course they're all available digitally now. You can get them from the AOPA airport directory, but they've got these airport diagrams that look like this. So even if you're not using an EFB that's got the digital map, you can get this map as well. And these are great for your larger airports because it shows you where all of the hotspots are. It shows you where the taxiways are. It makes it way easier so that way you don't get lost and you can keep yourself safe. All right, go ahead, Dan.
A neat tip that I hadn't thought of, because like I had mentioned that I used to print out the airport diagrams. If you've got a paper chart in addition to your EFB there, you can actually draw your taxi clearance on that chart, and then you've got that. You're able to recall that as you're going through. I thought that was a neat trip that I hadn't thought of. That I might try.
Yeah, I like that one. That's a good idea. In fact, the EFB people out there, maybe you can make something where we can digitally do that same thing. I love that idea of just drawing out the clearance so I can help follow it. So that's perfect. Okay. 2 to go. I think we can just about make it on time. And then, of course, we'll take time to answer any questions that you have. But when it comes to transitioning airspace, and by the way, I told you that as I was digging into this, I was like, oh my gosh, there's so much that I could talk about here. Like I said, next month, we're planning a part 2 where we will talk about the specific radio things. Maybe we'll get some radio examples to use and the phraseology you're going to use. And we'll go more into depth on this one because, my gosh, I went and I looked at the LA airspace when it came to VFR transitions. And I was like, holy cow. I use Phoenix right here because I've actually flown that one a bunch of times. And it's relatively simple, but the LA one is kind of nuts. So we'll try to go a little deeper dive into that for folks that are interested. But here's the deal. A VFR transition, as you can see here on the chart, are these magenta arrows, and they will lay out a course. Phoenix, they were creatively named the west and the east transition, depending on which way traffic was flowing. And so, you know, I would come out of Deer Valley, which is up here to the north, and we would just get right outside the Bravo, and we would call up Phoenix Approach and just ask them, Phoenix Approach, Cessna 65659er, requesting the VFR transition to the south. And then they would assign us either east or west, and we would just follow these visual points. We would go to Piestewa Peak, and then down, and we would know we would fly, and they would assign us an altitude as well, fly right over whatever the appropriately assigned thing was, and then head our way down to South Mountain and then out. So these are really great because it's an easy way for Bravo controllers to transition you through their airspace and without them having to give you a bunch of detailed instructions. You already know what to do. And again, they just assign you an altitude and you just stick with it and stay on frequency with them until you get clear of the Bravo. So transition is pretty cool. Like I said, the crazy one, that LA area. So like I said, I think we'll deep dive into that one a little bit because it's wild, the stuff in the LA one. So we'll look at that one. All right. And then there's also your VFR flyways. If I click here, it should pop up. And the flyways are on the back of your TAC chart. By the way, these transitions that I mentioned are on a TAC chart. I use SkyVector for these to get the graphics. But here are your flyways. These are these ones that basically transitions get you through the Bravo. I forgot to mention that Charlie and Delta, they don't really have transitions. Usually you just talk to them and they'll just give you a heading. So you just invite, just request what you want to do. But for the flyways, there are these blue ones on the back of the TAC, and they will keep you out of the Bravo if you follow them using various visual landmarks all along the way. And they even tell you what altitude, just stay 5,500 or below. And again, we'll go into more detail about this next time. All right, what do you got, Dan?
Well, just a couple came up when we were talking about tracing the taxiway diagrams, and that course apparently ForeFlight does that with the Apple Pencil. It already does it. So great, we learned something today.
I have not played with that yet, but that's exactly what I'm going to do after we're done here. I'm going to go mess with that because that's really cool. So see that we learned new stuff. So thank you, our sponsor Boeing and ForeFlight. Cool feature I didn't even know about. All right. So the VFR flyways, I've talked about that. And then the last bit is the special flight rules areas. At your really larger airports, you may have a special flight rules area. For example, LA's got one that has all these transitions through it. Oddly enough, and please, if somebody out there knows, I could not find any sort of training course on it, which really surprised me considering how seemingly complicated those are. So if anybody knows of anything, let me know. But yeah, that's a big part of LA. Now for DC and the Hudson River Corridor in New York, there are training courses on the FAAsafety.gov that you can take. So definitely for the DC one, you have to do it before you fly in the area around here for the SIFRA, we call it, the Special Flight Rules area. And then there's the whole thing. But then for the Hudson River Corridor, obviously you want to do it too because it gives you all the directions on how to operate properly. So check those out. What do you got, Dan?
Well, we've got a lot of questions to go through. I think looking at, we'll let you finish and then we'll get to questions.
And by the way, I see Tom. Hey, Stephen, if we can grab that YouTube video that Tom just put in, I'd love to see that for the LA airspace. Want to check that out. All right, let's go to our last slide here before we get to our questions and wrapping everything up. I got 1 minute. I can do this. Tips from the pros. Check it out in the Safety Advisor, that first link. And these are just some really good advice from the pros. I kind of modified them from exactly the way they did it with the airlines. But number one, as we already mentioned, review the airport diagram during your pre-flight preparation and then use it while you're taxiing. And now that we know with the EFB, we can even trace our taxi route. I love it. Split communications and taxiing with crew, but keep working together. So in other words, one person's in charge of taxiing and looking outside, the other person's in charge of talking to ATC and getting all the clearances down. We're both listening, but then we're communicating with each other because that way one person's heads down, the other person's heads up, but we help each other out. If in doubt, this is probably my number one rule. I should have put this one first. If in doubt, ask. Ask for clarification if you're not sure what's going on or what you want to do. Have that second pilot, if you've got a pilot working with you, write down any complex instructions and verify and read it back. And that's what it comes back to. Occasionally I hear this out here at Frederick. People will not read back the full ATC instruction of what they asked you to do. Read everything back. Make sure ATC, because that's another check. I read that whole thing back to whatever they told me to do, especially with directions and clearances, and that way they're verifying, did I hear it correctly? Just saying things like Roger or Wilco, that's not a good idea, because now I haven't had that safety check to make sure that I understood exactly what they wanted me to do. When crossing runways, suspend any cockpit duties. Don't be doing checklists, and you shouldn't be messing around with avionics anyway while you're taxiing. Suspend all of that while crossing runways and verify clearances if you're not absolutely sure that you're clear to cross the runway. And the last one, use taxi and landing lights to help cue other aircraft. So what the airlines will do apparently is, and it's like, we didn't do this when I was flying freight, but they would say, when I'm taxiing, like when I'm sitting still, taxi light off. When I go to taxi light on. When I stop, taxi light off. And then for takeoff and landing, I do this one. So when I go to take off, landing light is on, so people know, like, they have a cue of what's going on and what's happening. So really good tips there, things you might be able to use. And by the way, I know somebody said, I think it was Scott, said earlier, turning your lights on like in a Delta and stuff help people to see you. Yeah, absolutely. I turn my lights on, anything to help people sort of catch me, because sometimes it's hard to see other airplanes. Okay. We're 1 minute over, but let me officially come to the official end for those folks looking for the wings credit and everything else. But we are going to stick around and answer your questions. So I know Dan's been monitoring, but here it is. Here is number one. Before I even go to that slide, if you are looking for wings credit, if you didn't hear us earlier, you don't have to do anything. As long as you registered with your FAAsafety.gov email that you use, you're good to go. We will take care of it. There's nothing you need to do. Stephen is on it. He's going to submit that, goes through our process here, and it gets to the FAA. So we've got that covered. However, if you're also looking for the AOPA pilot passport, the app, here is your code right there on the lower left-hand corner. It's YCFWeb04 2023. Stephen, you want to take a quick moment and explain why folks might want to do the AOPA pilot passport thing?
Sure. The passport function is part of the AOPA app, but it's built into the app. You have to download that first. Login, so that will be the same as your normal AOPA login for your account information. And it is a way to look up different airports, get information, and lets you check into them. So it kind of gamifies it a little bit, where you can check in different locations, learn stuff about it, leave a review, and you earn some badges and points for checking in. And I know our marketing team occasionally does some contests and things, does some prizes for folks who participate in that program. So if you want to check it out, our code is a special thing they set up for us for attending our webinar. And you get a special badge for that.
And Stephen, you can, in fact, you can even say, because I know that you like to play with this thing, not only are you a provider, but you're a user.
I am indeed. I've been testing out its abilities and uses. I know it does require to be at least 3 miles from an airport location in order to check in at that airport, but I can't confirm that does work from the air. I would not recommend doing it while you're actively flying.
Good.
But if you're the passenger, you can totally hop on the app and check in as long as you got service. I did it from a train recently. That works too. If the train's going by, it works. You just have to be within 3 miles of the airport to check in at that location.
Yep. So Stephen is good. I know he's a good time playing with that. So check it out if you're interested. Again, please understand, that code has nothing to do with wings credit. This is just for the AOPA app pilot passport. And also, please jot the code down, because what typically happens is we've got an amazing audience here, and you guys all start trying to log in and it crashes the server or whatever. So try to spread that out. Maybe you log in half an hour or an hour or so. Just sort of spread it out, and that way you'll be able to get your points if you're looking for that.
Yes, the code will be good for 30 days. And yeah, the server for the app, it gets a little over flooded during our presentation. So give a little bit of time if it's not responding right away.
Which, by the way, I love our audience for that. You guys are awesome that we got such a great audience here, and then that's pretty cool that you're able to do that. All right, next month, here's what we're doing. May 18th, and we'll do questions right after this. May 18th, 2023 from 12 to 1 p.m. Hey, we forgot to put the universal UTC time on the air. What do we say it was? I think it's 1400, no, 14 or 1500.
16 hours, 4 hours.
There it is. 12 plus 4, there it is. So 1600 UTC, we're going to start putting that on because we've had some requests. So I think that everybody should be on UTC anyway, because I think it would get rid of all this time zone confusion. But that's just me. Next month, Bravo Charlie, Bravo. Charlie's flying in the big time, mastering Bravo and Charlie airspace. So we're going to really do a deep dive into that operational stuff that folks are often asking about. And like I said, we'll get into like, I love that. I want to check out that video that somebody recommended from, I think it was Pilot Edge, about the LA transitions and all that. So we'll go into that. And like I said, I spent an entire year every day flying out of a Bravo airport. So we'll try to share some good tips with you and hopefully take some of that any kind of tentative part away of flying through these types of airspace. So we'll go really in depth. Anyway, let's hit the questions up, you guys. What do you got, Dan?
Okay, I'm just typing one out here real quickly. All right, so first of all, whatever AOPA is paying Chris Moser, it's not enough. So I appreciate that.
By the way, you're talking to the right person, so please take note of that, Dan.
I thought that was great. That was awesome. So I mean, there's a ton. A lot of them was related to, were related to like the Class B transitions, things like that. So I'm going to try to get to those, knowing that we're going to get them next time. But all right, people keep adding stuff in, so it keeps moving my screen. Sorry. Everyone's got to stop so I can actually hold on this.
You take 2 minutes. Dan's overloaded with questions.
It is. It's just going berserk. I can't hold my screen steady enough to get back to the questions. We talked about that. We talked about that. I struggle with ATC speaking too quickly. Any tips?
Yes, big thing there. Remember that don't be afraid to use a term like for our Rusty Pilot folks, when we do those courses, we will tell them, even though it's not an official call sign, like, we have student pilot as a call sign, and we're obviously not supposed to use that once you have your certificate. Don't be afraid to say something like, I'm a Rusty Pilot, or, or just let them know I'm a little, like, I'm new to this, or just give them the heads up, because them rapid firing stuff off to you and having to repeat it 2 or 3 times, if you just let them know, like, hey, I'm new at this, can you go a little slower? It'll take them less time to go a little slower for handling you than it would be for them to repeat it multiple times. So don't be afraid to just tell them. It's like, can you go a little slower for me? Now, please understand that if you are trying to work with them and it is like peak time for them when there's a ton of arrivals, that you may get put to the side a little bit because they've got to handle all that other traffic. So what I would recommend that you do is try to time some of the flights, when there's not some of your flights when you want to talk to ATC that way, especially going to a Bravo or a Charlie, maybe when they're not as busy. Typically at night is a good time for that kind of stuff. They won't be as busy, and that way you can get used to talking to them and then ramp up to that speed. Another way to do it is if you already have your private, work towards your instrument rating, because you'll become amazing on the radios during your instrument rating. And the other part too is, it's like, even with a ton of experience, like I said, I flew out of a Bravo every day, but there are places like New York, I have never heard air traffic control speak so quickly as it is there. There you go. Somebody mentioned atclive.com as well as a great source. I love that. Yeah, don't do that at JFK. Exactly, Brad, because that's they're going to be like, yep, you need to stay away. But like I said, try to go to like a Charlie or something where it's not quite as busy, and start just work your way into that, because once you get the format and you kind of get the hang of what they're going to do, and that craft clearance is helpful too, it gets better. And then, and then somebody said, if you talk slowly, they tend to slow down as well. So don't be afraid to just ask for help. Tell them what's going on, and they're usually pretty good about it. Like I said, if it's crunch time and it's a really busy Bravo, they may just kind of be like, hey, I need you to stay clear, because they don't have time. But go when it's not as busy, and I bet they'll be willing to help you.
Cool. Do you recommend turning on a strobe and landing lights when crossing a runway during taxi?
That makes sense. I typically don't turn strobes on. And it's not that I'm right by any means. I'm not going to prescribe any of that sort of thing. But turning lights on when you're crossing a runway, not a bad idea. And I know that our Air Safety Institute folks that I've flown with here, they do that as well. So it's not a bad idea. It's just not something that I have to build up that habit myself in doing that. But yeah, make yourself visible so people can see you.
Here's a what would you do question. When departing a Class Delta airport and the tower tells you straight out departure, I'll call your turn. And you're about to break into Class Bravo airspace, but the tower seems to be too busy. What do you do? What do you do in that situation where you're following guidance and they're not getting to you in time before you're going to do something that you shouldn't?
Okay, so really the situation there would be, is it Bravo in the vertical where I can just stop climbing and stay clear of it? Or is it like a wall that I'm coming up against, like the boundary of it? Obviously, in either case, whether it's I stop climbing or I'm heading towards sort of the vertical wall, I'm not going to go into it because you're the one that's going to get in trouble for doing that. So in that case, that's where that piloting command authority is. That you've got to be able to say, I'm not doing this because I'm going to break a reg or it's a safety thing or whatever it might be. So yeah, do not. You just need to and you tell them. It's like you turn and they say, what are you doing? And say, I was about to go into the Bravo. So I turned away. Maybe you start circling or whatever to stay clear of it. So yeah, don't be afraid to exercise piloting command authority because remember, they're human. The other part too is query them. If you're heading towards that, then query them. Let them know, I'm 3 miles from the Bravo or whatever it is. I'm approaching Bravo. Is it okay for me to turn on course? But if it comes down to it, you just turn and circle or do whatever you need to do. Stay out of it. Don't get yourself in trouble because you're trying to comply with the clearance and they either got distracted or whatever might have happened. Because remember, they're people too.
When you're flying over the top of Class Charlie or Delta, do you contact the tower?
It's not a bad idea. Obviously, you need to contact them if you're asking the question was Charlie or Delta. So for Delta, it's up to you. It's not a bad idea. Like if you've got the wherewithal and the capacity, then talking to them is not a big deal because you can at least advise them that you're flying over in the area. Obviously, if you're going through, you need to get permission. I'd have to go back and look at Charlie. As I recall, you're able to fly over Charlie without talking to them, but don't hold me to that. I'd want to double check my regs on that one. I just don't have that up there at the top of my thing right here. But again, honestly, if I'm that high that I'm crossing over Charlie, more than likely I'm on with flight following. If I'm doing something like that, I'm going to get flight following anyway, and then I'm already talking to them. So my recommendation would be generally talk to them. No, you don't have to, but remember, think of that like the Charlie is like a little mushroom. It's up like a little mushroom shape. That top of it, what's coming out of the top of that? That's airliners and business jets and things coming out of the top. So it's a good idea to be talking to them so that you can be advised of this traffic that's climbing very quickly and very fast. So that's why we have those recommendations of talking to them when you're over it.
Chris, referring to craft, the question is, you get the craft after you say what with a question mark? Is that after you would say something like 525?
Oh, so this is going to happen before you taxi. So you're at a Charlie or a Bravo airport. Like I said, very unusual at a Delta. Typically, that's going to be a like at the Tersa where I was, and I'll explain that in a second. So at a Bravo or Charlie, you get in the airplane, you've potentially fired up the engine, you've gotten your ATIS, and so after you get your ATIS, you're going to look up, and you should already hopefully have at your reference the clearance delivery frequency, and you'll call them and say, this is, I'm just trying to think. We'll use Tucson because I used to fly there. Tucson clearance delivery, Cessna 65659er, ready to pick up my clearance, my VFR clearance. And then you might even tell them requesting VFR clearance to whatever airport where you're going to go. So maybe I'm heading back up to Phoenix. So then they're going to come back and give you those VFR directions. So you're going to request from clearance delivery a VFR departure clearance to wherever you're going. And in fact, in that case, you might just say, without doing the sort of short cold call, especially if you think they might be busy, Tucson, clearance delivery sets to 65659er, requesting VFR clearance. And they're going to come back and they're going to want to know, what kind of airplane, Cessna 172. They're probably going to want to know, they're certainly going to want to know your altitude and where, that sort of thing, your destination. So
Cool.
They'll help you with it. Don't worry.
Cool. When you're told to proceed on course, but you're not centered, like let's say you've got that GPS line going and you're not centered on the Magenta line, do you proceed parallel to that line or do you turn to intersect that line when you're told to proceed on course?
I don't know that it's like, I would probably go back and intercept my line, or maybe I would just do a direct to. That's your preference. I don't think ATC is going to be picking on you that much about that. Basically, what they've been doing is giving you guidance to get out of the airspace and clear of traffic. Once they tell you resume your own navigation, for example, or turn on course, that is up to you. So it's like I said, you could either go to that other waypoint, hit direct to, and just reset from there, or you could go back over. If you're in doubt for some reason, don't be afraid to ask them. But I don't know that it really matters in either case. It's like I probably would vector my way over unless I was way like they got me way away from it. I'm probably going to just do the direct to my next waypoint just to pick it up from there.
Okay. There's a lot of notes
Like Brad
and
says,
questions.
resume, do what you want. It's really up to you. Go ahead.
There you go. Lots of notes and questions on, really more notes than questions, just about just being thorough. And if you have a question, ask. Or if something doesn't seem right, just ask and keep that two-way communication going. That's what ATC is there for. They're there for your safety and for everyone else's safety. So it was an example. It just notified tower after being cleared for departure that another aircraft was on short final. And the reality there was that, you know, it was a miss, and they appreciated that information. So I thought that was
That's a great story, because in fact, I meant to put that in here and I forgot about it till you just mentioned that. I had that happen for that pilot and command authority thing that I mentioned earlier. I was here at Frederick. I was on the left downwind for 2-3. There was another airplane coming in from the west, and they had them set up for a right downwind for 2-3. That pilot, though, wasn't doing a great job of reporting where they were. And so I was basically downwind, getting ready to turn base, and I could see the airplane they were talking to, they had asked where they were, and I think they said they were midfield downwind, but in reality, they were ready to turn base. And so as I turn base, I see them turn base, and now we're nose to nose. And so right away, I was already ready to break off. And I said to ATC, I'm like, I'm going to break off, or I'm going to make a right 360 because I got an airplane at my 12 o'clock. And so then ATC, because remember, they're visual, they have no radar, right? In fact, they're not even allowed to use ADSB, which blows my mind why they can't. Let's give them foreflight. But so ATC was like, "What? Where is he?" I'm like, "I got an airplane at my 12 o'clock on the right base or whatever." So I broke off, and he was like, "Yeah, do what you got to do." And then that pilot got scolded because they clearly were not reporting where they were, and they were doing sort of their own thing. So that's where that pilot and command authority comes in. Remember that just because ATC told you to do something, it is still your responsibility for the safe operation of that aircraft. Don't be afraid to exercise that when you need to.
on the departure flow. When should you switch from ground to tower?
On the departure from ground to tower, my recommendation is ground to tower. What I do is I get down. I've gotten to my taxi. I've gotten down to the run-up area, assuming right near the end of the runway. So it depends. I'm assuming near the end of the runway, right? I do my run-up. At that point, when I start to do my run-up, I will flip over to tower. And that's at a Delta, right? So it's like, and I would probably do the same thing at a Charlie and a Bravo, because at this point now I'm starting to try to listen to tower to see what's going on. If you're at a bigger airport, and maybe like when I was flying freight, I was at Phoenix Sky Harbor, I recall doing my run up in different places because we couldn't just go to the end of the runway. They wanted you to be ready when you get down there to go. So I would do my run up and then I would taxi. And so at that point, it's like I might wait for the handoff or get to like right at the hold short line, and then I would flip over to tower. So like I said, if you're at a Delta, typical Delta, you get to that run-up area, you're at the end of the runway, I'm going to flip. Let's say your run-up area is someplace weird, though. I'm probably going to stay on ground, because I probably would tell them, hey, I'm going to pull over here and do my run-up, and then let you know when I'm done. So you have to communicate with them.
Okay.
Hope that makes sense.
Yeah. So for a remotely controlled tower, so a remotely operated tower, I've been told to report leaving the airspace. I've never been asked for this report elsewhere. Is there any guidance about that? Is that something new about being asked to report leaving the airspace?
That's an interesting one. I know we have one of those down at Leesburg. I have not flown into that one though, but that's an ATC request, right? Report leaving the airspace, and of course it makes sense why they would want that. They are not there visually seeing you.
Right.
They want to know when they're clear of your responsibility. So in that case, I would just report leaving the airspace. We often do that over here at Martinsburg with the tower. We'll tell them, hey, I'm leaving the, in fact, we'll do it as a queue, sort of like maybe I want to get a frequency change to talk to Potomac, or I just want a frequency change to get on to the next thing I'm going to do. Even if I'm inside their airspace, you might request that, but certainly leaving their airspace. And in fact, Martinsburg will tell you, you're leaving the Martinsburg airspace, frequency change approved, right? They'll tell you that kind of thing. So every airspace, every tower is a little different, but yeah, if they ask you to do it, then I would help them out. Let them know you're leaving.
Cool. Couple of flight following questions. Home airport underneath shelf of class Charlie would like to pick up flight following on the ground. Any recommended procedures for that?
So I'm assuming it is a Delta airport versus a non-towered field. So let's say it's a Delta airport, you've got a tower there. You can ask them on the ground. You can say, like, I'd like to request flight following. Can you help me coordinate that? Because the tower is not going to be able to do that for you typically, but they might be able to make the call to departure and let them know, hey, because remember, they're talking to them for IFR departures. So you could say, like, we've got this person requesting flight following. They may be able to coordinate with you. If they can't, then take off, get clear of the Delta, or here, we will even tell them before I'm out of the Delta, I'd like to contact Potomac Approach to get flight following. They'll clear you earlier to change frequency, and then call and request your flight following. If you're at a non-towered field, obviously you can't do that. But then soon after takeoff, get clear of the pattern, and then just do your normal call to request flight following.
Gotcha. When using flight following and flying through Delta or Charlie, does tower change? Let's see. Sorry. When using flight following and flying through Delta or Charlie, tower airspace, does the pilot change frequencies and contact tower, or does flight following manage the transition?
They will manage the transition for you. They'll tell you contact tower or contact this next approach sector. If you're not sure, like they've got you headed straight into a Delta, right? And as you're getting close to that, so let's say like 5-10 miles out, don't be afraid to ask them. It's like, are you gonna, should I be expecting that switch over? Because my experience typically has been that they're gonna switch you over. However, in some cases, they might say, no, you're gonna stay with me. So if you're not sure, clarify. That's pretty low, like flying like on flight following to go through a Delta, because they're typically only 2,500 feet AGL. So that's relatively low.
Right. So here's a tip. It was explained as a pet peeve, but we'll turn it into a tip from a controller friend. Was pilots who key the mic before they think about what they want to say is a pet peeve, or for controllers, and a great tip for all of us.
Yes, always plan ahead what you're going to do. Don't do the airline pilot, the stereotypical airline pilot joke thing. Don't do that. But make sure you're ready to go.
How about this? If tower is busy, or ATC in general is busy, is it necessary to ask for a frequency change?
So say that again. If tower is busy, is it
necessary to ask for a frequency change? I mean, I guess if you're within their airspace, you got to stay there. But once you exit the airspace,
you're on your own. Yeah. So once you clear their airspace, then you don't need to worry about it anymore. So if they're really busy, you don't need to request a frequency change, as long as you're sure that you've either climbed out of the top of it or you're past that lateral boundary. At that case, once you're clear, you're out of their control, and they're, sort of their little kingdom or whatever you want to call it, their area of authority, then you're okay to switch over.
Okay. Question regarding an F-16. I think we're going to leave that one. We had a lost comms question. Well, situation.
Oh shoot! I forgot to put. We'll do that next time. Okay. I had a lost comms thing I was going to do, and I somehow missed that on the slide when I put it. I mean, when I'm putting that slide in, I can't believe I forgot that one. We didn't talk about light gun signals, everybody. Unbelievable.
What is the proper procedure to switch from ground to tower before takeoff? We kind of talked about this, and vice versa after landing. Is it required to tell one agency you're switching?
So, like I said, the recommendation I would give you is that when on ground, you get to the hold short line or the run up area, assuming it's right next to the hold short line, you can go ahead and flip over, and because you're going to taxi up to the hold short line and call. Obviously, if you need to do something where, like during your run up, you got to taxi back, you just get back on with ground. When it comes to landing, so you're on with tower, generally speaking, what you're going to do is you get clear of the hold short line and stop, right? So get clear of the runway and stop, then you can switch over to ground. Normally, if tower wants you to stay on with them, they will tell you, stay on with me and taxi whatever. Otherwise, you are safe to, once you're off that runway, you're safe to just go ahead and call ground. And so you gotta kind of just do it from there. Every once in a while, there's kind of weird things that will happen, but normally they'll tell you, and they're not going to get yelled at for switching if you're in the other person's environment to switch over to that frequency.
Okay.
So, like for example, they'll say, clear to land runway 23, and like usually as you're landing or something, or you're on short final, they'll say, clear to land 23, and then as you're doing that or whatever, rolling out, they'll say, 656 stay with me for taxi.
All right. This is in regards to departures from a non-controlled airport IFR. Do you follow traffic flow until clearing the area, then contact ATC, or do you just fly the clearance and contact ATC?
That's a good. So when they say the traffic flow, I mean they must mean departing the pattern. if I'm on, well, number one, when you're on an IFR clearance and you're in VFR conditions, which in this case we must be, because if we were in IMC conditions, this wouldn't be irrelevant. You would fly the ODP or the departure procedure or the clearance, whatever was given, right? If you're in VFR conditions, your responsibility is to not be disruptive to that VFR traffic. So I would say that what you're going to do is basically for a VFR or a departure out of a non-tower field, it's a straight up climb anyway, or a 45-degree turn. So I would just get clear of the pattern and then proceed on with whatever your IFR clearance says. But yeah, if you've got other VFR traffic and you're leaving IFR, you do not have priority over them. You still have to maintain maintain visual separation and not be disruptive to that pattern. That was clear guidance. We talked about this a couple episodes ago, and I was looking that stuff up, and it was very clear about that.
Okay. This was about touch and goes and that whole chapter that we went through there, touch and goes and stop and goes and all that.
Yeah.
In some airplanes, you never do a touch and go. What is the correct verbiage to tell ground you want to return to takeoff again? So I assume that it's towered field, you land, you contact ground for the first time. What would you say to try to get back to the
to take off again? So I'm assuming they're talking about a full stop taxi back. So what you want to do then is let tower know that, because we do that with some people doing solos and things like that, right? So it's like, I want to do a full stop taxi back. So requesting full stop taxi backs. So they'll know what that means. Basically, you're going to stop, you're going to taxi off, you get clear. They'll hand it. Sometimes, depending on how busy they are, you may stay on with tower. They'll just say, stay with me, taxi back down, let me know when you're ready to go. Or if they're busy, they're going to put you on with ground, you'll taxi back down, go to the runway and get back on with tower. So it depends. It's like they'll tell you what they want you to do with contacting ground or tower, and you'll hear that phrase, stay with me, or something to that effect, if they want you to stay on frequency with tower. But yeah, that's just ask for a full stop taxi back. They'll know what that means.
Okay. How about fly to the numbers?
Fly to the numbers. I'm not sure if the person is still on. Yeah, they didn't specify what is that happening.
That was it. I just thought that was curious and wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, all I can think of is it's like they are talking about, I don't know. I want to know approach, departure. It's like maybe the departure, they want you to stay to the end of the runway. Obviously that is slang. I don't think that's official ATC terminology. So yeah, I'd want to know the situation you're having that in.
How brushed up are
somebody
you?
Says AIM 4-3-14, Jonathan. Let's check that out. It says do not go to ground until advised. Let me pull that one up. Go ahead, Dan, ask the question.
Well, no, go ahead and look that one up. We'll stay on that because I don't want to get you.
Okay. All right, it says pilots of departing aircraft should communicate tower control on appropriate ground prior to starting engines to receive it. Unless otherwise advised by the tower, remain on that frequency during taxi and run up, then change the local frequency when ready to request takeoff clearance. So there you go. So the thing I was saying was I will flip over early. I do that here at Frederick, but there you go. So the guidance from AIM is to stay on ground until you actually taxi up and are ready to go. So I will defer to that. Thank you for the clarification. I appreciate that.
All right, here is a helicopter operation question. So I know you're very familiar with that, so I'm excited to hear the answer. So when I ask tower to land a helicopter at a non-movement area, controllers no longer use the phrase proceed as requested. Should I assume I can land unless I'm explicitly told not to, or is there some new phraseology?
My goodness, I don't know the answer to that one off the top of my head. So I don't want to talk about helicopters not knowing that. We'd have to ask somebody that one. But my assumption would be, this is my uneducated assumption when it comes to helicopters, is that you still need to hear the cleared to land, I would imagine, for wherever you're going to land. So maybe somebody in the audience knows the answer to that one and can chime in.
Where's Michael?
Yeah, exactly. Where's Michael? We need Michael.
Right. What about landing in a delta under a Bravo veil? Do you need to talk to approach under the veil? I talk to approach for sequencing, but sometimes they say just check in with the tower.
Yep. So as long, and then we'll talk about this more next time when we talk about dealing with flyways and all the other stuff. But basically, as long as you're outside of the Bravo or a Charlie, if you're not in their airspace, you don't have to worry about you don't have to talk to them. I'd recommend it if possible. Talk to them. It's good because you're getting flight following and traffic advisories and everything else. But here we go. Somebody's talking about the flight of the numbers. We'll have to check those out. See if they can clarify that. But that said, if you can just talk to Delta and go in as long as you stay out of whatever the other airspace is. You don't have to talk to them. Just don't go into their airspace without clearance.
If you only have a single comm and are in contact with approach, how do you get ATIS?
Then what you want to do is request from them, let them know. They might say, you got to get ATIS, or I know I got to get ATIS. Just say, like the request frequency change to get the ATIS. And so normally what will happen is they'll say, okay, 65619, report back on frequency. So they will let you go off frequency, get your ATIS, and then when you come back on, just report that you're back up. And tell them at that point, tell them I've got information, Zulu or whatever it is. Here's somebody I want to see what they're saying about the fly to the numbers thing. Oh my gosh, I moved the questions and now I can't see anything. Fly to the numbers, but I don't remember what it meant. Inbound, proceed to the numbers is normal, used for traffic spacing. Expect aircraft on base, aircraft on final. All right, so basically what they're saying is it's almost a thing where it's assumed the numbers is that the landing under the runway, I was in the pattern and confused on whether he wanted a short approach or not. So here's a good question. That's the thing. It's like verify with them, but it sounds like what these other folks are saying is they wanted me to round off to get to the runway faster. In other words, so that, to me, that's a short approach. So right. I would want to hear them say, make a short approach, but fly to the numbers. Apparently what other folks are saying is it sounds like they just want you to cut it off and get to the runway as efficiently as possible.
Okay.
So yeah, but notice how a lot of people are saying I assumed was. So this is why we need to clarify. And my guess is that may be slang or maybe it's older terminology. I just haven't heard that, but I may be wrong.
Gotcha. On a 3 mile base, how do we know when we're 3 miles from the runway center line?
Good question. You just have to do your best to estimate it. I was speaking with, it was Damien, who was our air traffic control guest on some time ago, and he asked me, how do we know that? And of course, you can use GPS if you've got it. What I do with the GPS is I will add on, depending on the length of the runway. Here at Frederick, it's about 5,000 feet, so it's about, the GPS is going to measure to the center of the airport. So I typically will add about a half mile onto whatever the GPS says to give me a more accurate distance from the end of the runway. But you just have to do your best to estimate. Remember, ATC in these cases, they're using binoculars and stuff like that. So they're doing their estimates as well. So don't feel like you have to be exactly on. Just learn to judge. I like to play a game with a GPS when coming into an airport where I am watching and I'm saying, I don't look at the GPS, I've got it in there, but I'm going like, I think I'm about 7 miles now, and I'll look and see. And you get pretty good at estimating what that is, and just do your best estimate.
If your airplane doesn't have GPS nor DME, how do you know the distance from the airport?
There you go. So it's a question exactly there of learning how to estimate. Just do the best you can. If you have to use landmarks, it's just a skill you just develop over time. And if possible, you may have landmarks you can use too. So
I think that puts us at a good spot, Chris, at 1:32 p.m.
All right. Well, it's 1:32. So Dan and Stephen, thanks for being here. Audience, appreciate you guys being here. It's an amazing audience again today. You guys are sharp and we appreciate that. And so don't forget, next time we will do a deeper dive, and I've got to make a note, 2 things, to go play with my ForeFlight to learn how to highlight the taxi diagram, because that sounds really cool. And then the other one being to remember, maybe we should throw in some light gun signals, because I cannot believe that I forgot that one
Lost
today.
comms. Yep.
Oh my gosh, because I had a whole spiel too that I do with Delta and how to get in and out when you have lost comms. So anyway, next time, Bravo, Charlie's flying in the big time, mastering Bravo and Charlie airspace. We will see you then, and appreciate you all being here. So thanks so much, and don't be afraid to hit us up at ftinitiative@aopa.org with any questions or anything you'd like help with. Other than that, thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.